Reading the Bible is like hiking through wild, breathtaking terrain, and a good guide makes all the difference. They know the twists and turns, the hidden wonders, and the best views. That's why today we're talking with a biblical scholar to help us understand, enjoy, and apply God's Word. Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Bible Savvy Podcast. I'm Clayton Keenan, and today we're going to be talking about how to understand, enjoy, and apply the book of Joshua. On this episode, we are joined by Dr. Richard Hess. Dr. Hess is the Distinguished Professor of Old Testament and Semitic Languages at Denver Seminary. He's an expert in the Old Testament, in interpretation and theology, in Hebrew, in biblical archaeology, in ancient Near Eastern texts that are related to the Old Testament, a whole bunch of things. And he has written a number of books, including commentaries on the Song of Songs and Leviticus, and most pertinently for today, the book of Joshua. That's why we're going to be talking to him. Over the course of the next month, we are going to be reading the book of Joshua together as a church in our Bible Savvy reading plan. So we thought, let's get an expert on to help us get our bearings on this book that some people find very challenging. So we're very excited to have Dr. Hess today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Clayton. It's really nice to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump in. We always like to start with context when we're reading something, kind of get the big picture of things. So let's talk about Joshua, where it fits in the storyline of the Bible. Where does it fit kind of chronologically and in the flow of the narrative?
Yeah, those are good questions and important ones, actually, for Joshua, because it is a lot of story or narrative, people call it. It is a lot of what many of us regard as history. And so where is that? So, of course, Joshua sort of comes, well, it doesn't sort of, it actually comes after the whole accounts of creation in Genesis, of the people of Israel being chosen and called by God and growing into a nation there in Egypt, and then coming out of Egypt and being led by God and the human leader Moses leading them to the promised land, but not quite. They stopped just east of the Jordan River, and there, looking over the Jordan River on Mount Nebo, Moses dies. And at that point, Joshua becomes leader of the people, and the leadership passes to him. And so the story of Joshua in the book of Joshua is about him leading the people under God's guidance and direction across the Jordan River into the promised land, and then on to acquire and to allot the promised land as God's covenantal gift to his people. And it then sets up, because by the time the book of Joshua comes to the end, and it ends with Joshua's death and that of the high priest, you have the preparation then for Israel now settled in the land, and what's going to happen next as you have the story of the judges and God raising up leaders to lead his people and to enable them, deliver them from oppression and all kinds of problems, and that they're falling into sin. And then the comings of kings, of course, of which the greatest is King David, and the promise of King David's rulership, and with that of the line that leads directly to Jesus, and the promise of the Messiah, where that is fulfilled in Jesus, who is the Messiah, the Christ. But Joshua sits right there at a critical point of leading us from the wilderness into the promised land, and realizing that, well, why is it called promised? Well, because it was a promise from God, and realizing that promise.
Yeah, so it's a very hinge kind of moment here that we've got. Give us kind of at a 30,000-foot view, what are some of the themes that we might be looking at as we're reading the book of Joshua?
Yeah, it's a great book I had when I began to write my commentary and study it directly about, a long time ago now, it's 30-some years ago, one of the great Old Testament scholars said to me, I can't imagine a book with more problems than the book of Joshua in terms of difficulty. On the one hand, it's easy to read. It's a narrative. It's you don't have trouble understanding that. It's not got all kinds of, weird sacrifices and stuff in it. But on the other hand, it is just so so full of issue, which I think maybe we will touch upon here and there. But if you're going to kind of look over Joshua, well, one of the things that you begin with is that the sense of Joshua as called by God to minister to his people. So from chapter 1 on, you have this sense of what is it like to lead and minister to God's people. What does that look like? And Joshua is a great example of that. He's given a charge there at the beginning, a vision of what he is to do with his life, there in verses 1 through 5, and then in verses 5 through 9, which, by the way, that vision, because he fulfills it, is actually a table of contents for the book. It really forms that. And then verses 5 through 9 are the way in which he will do it, by the presence of God. And the presence of God in Joshua, and the people's hearing that presence, following that presence, is just such a wonderful theme that goes through. When they do that, they cannot lose. When they don't, they cannot win. And it's pretty simple in terms of the rest of the story as far as that goes. But then we trace it through. And one of the great themes of Joshua is God's salvation and the way in which he saves. A lot of times, and I want to talk about the destruction of the Canaanites and this sort of thing, and that's important. But you realize in Joshua 1, how is he going to deliver and give to the people the land, and what is that going to look like? And then chapter 6 through 12 are the story of that, beginning with Jericho, then the southern coalition of cities that come up against Joshua and Israel, and then the northern coalition of cities that come up against Joshua and Israel, and then the allotment, the giving out, the realization of the covenant as the land is allotted, and then the renewal of that covenant in the end. But set alongside of that is that's chapter 1 and everything. But chapter 2 of Joshua is the story of Rahab, the prostitute, and the Canaanite. And that's so interesting because, Rahab, of course, is in the line of Christ, leading to Christ. We read that in Matthew 1, and she's mentioned there. But what's interesting about chapter 2 of Joshua is that doesn't have to be in the book for the whole story to flow. The story can flow about Joshua leading the people into the land and everything else, and you could kind of bring in Rahab in chapter 6 with Jericho and the destruction of Jericho like they do. But why is so much time spent with Rahab? And I can talk more about this, but Rahab is really a figure who kind of is a correspondent to Joshua in chapter 1. Joshua is called to lead his people to fulfill God's promises and to realize their full salvation and the blessing. Rahab is called to lead her people, in this case her family, to fulfill God's promises and to realize their salvation. There really is a correspondence here, and it shows that God's plan isn't just for his chosen people, as important as that is, but it's for the world. The people of God, as it says in Exodus 19, are called to be a royal priesthood. They are to represent God to the world. And Rahab is part of that world. And she is one who represents a figure who, like us, hears the gospel, responds, and follows God. And so she's a really kind of and I think that's why so much interest is given to her, because she too can know salvation and does, and her family, just as Joshua and Israel do.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, those are a few things jumping around.
This actually leads into one of the really difficult questions about the book.
Yeah.
And you hear that and you say, wow, look, the salvation can come to even, Rahab and people like that. And yet it's framed by the fact that Israel is invading and taking a land that people are already living in. And this troubles a lot of people when they read it. Just the simple fact that there's already people there and they're just going to invade. From a 21st century perspective, we've seen the history of the world where there have been all sorts of people who have gone in and driven out people or oppressed people or taken land. And these, sorts of things are disturbing to us. So help us understand why God would command Israel to take land from, people that are already there by force. And how do we wrestle with that today?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a very important question. And I do a lecture on Joshua and genocide because, it's a whole big area. In fact, in some ways, the idea of God being just a mean guy in the Old Testament especially is one of the foremost questions that often troubles people when they come to the claims of Christianity. And where that often focuses is on Joshua, because you've got all these stories of the Canaanites and everything else. And I can go through this some, but I want to say here a few things. First of all, by background, if you look, of course, you go all the way back to Genesis 15, and there is where Abram is promised this land that God would give it, but not to him, but 4 generations or 400 years, depending upon it. It says 2 different. Anyway, in the future for his descendants. And it says there in 15, it says, for the iniquity or sin of the Amorites, who are the people living in the land, as we heard at that time, has not yet reached its fullness. And it's almost as though God is saying, well, you get the land until you sin to a certain point, and then there has to be a response, or there is no such thing as good and evil. There is no such thing as blessing and a withholding of blessing because of the way in which you have lived and acted. And this happens to Israel. In the end, it too turns away from God and it's cast out of the land for a time, but then there is a possibility of return. And I think that's an element. But interestingly enough, the book of Joshua never mentions so much the sin of the of the Canaanites. Talks about God's gift of the land. There's a couple of other texts, if I may, that I would want to talk about. One, which people don't often look at, is the story of Joseph. And you may remember in the story of Joseph how he goes into the land. He's a grandson of Isaac, and then the son of who's the son of Abram, and so that promise continues. He's one of the 12 brothers. He goes sold into slavery, rises up in Egypt by interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh and acquiring, during 7 years of plenty, they acquire all this grain and food. And then it says there are 7 years of famine, just as the dreams of Pharaoh, which Joseph predicted, come. And during that 7 years of famine, it says in Genesis 45 how the land wasted away and the people were coming to acquire grain. Of course, that's how Jacob and his sons get reconnected with Joseph, because they come to buy grain in Egypt. But it says all the land of Canaan and Egypt would have wasted away. Now, isn't that interesting? Because in that generation, had God not provided through Joseph, a son of Israel, the means by which to keep this grain, there would have been no Canaanites. There would have been no Egyptians. They would have either had to flee and go someplace else on earth where they could find food, or they would have died. That's the implication of that text. And that's why at the end in Genesis 50, in the end of the book of Genesis, the brothers say to Joseph, "Are you going to, please don't kill us, have mercy." And Joseph says, "Look, you intended this for evil, but God intended it for good, selling me into slavery. The saving of many lives." Now, oftentimes we think of that with regards to Jacob's family, and that's true, the children of Israel, but it's also true for Egypt and for Canaan. And there's a way of looking at this, I think it's quite true. I mean, the very next page, the Egyptians are out trying to commit genocide against Israel. They want to kill all the male babies in Israel. Well, that's not good. That's no way to repay Israel and God for what he had done, yet that's what they do. And then, as Israel comes into the promised land, the Canaanites are rising up, and they're after Israel. I mean, we can talk about what happens with Jericho and I believe these are not really towns or cities, and I can talk about the texts that you may want to mention, but they actually don't support that. I believe they're forts. I believe they're outposts. Jericho is an outpost at this point. There's not a lot of archaeology indicating it was inhabited, whether take an early date or a late date for the Exodus or whatever. There just weren't people there. But I believe there was a garrison there, garrisoned by the cities in the hill country, like Jerusalem, the Canaanite Jerusalem, and Bethel and others. And I believe the same with Ai. It was an outpost for Bethel to protect the roots up to it. So they come and they do capture these, and there's a whole thematic or theological theme about this and about the Ark of the Covenant and the way in which God's purpose and intention will not be thwarted either by natural means, that's why the River Jordan just dries up, or by human means. That's why the walls, which represent the barrier around Jericho, fall down, because there is nothing that will stand in the way of the ongoing work of God. But these are forts, and these are primarily military outposts, with the exception of Rahab and her family, and there's a reason anyway. But I want to go on and just skim through this. I want to talk also about Joshua 10 and 11, because what they're doing then with most of Canaan, which is Joshua 10 and 11, the southern coalition of kings led by the king of Jerusalem, who's Canaanite, and the northern coalition led by the king of Hatzor, who also is Canaanite. These are Canaanite. And if you read the text there in chapters 10 and 11, what you learn is that these groups were out to destroy Israel. It's not that Israel went, no, I want to fight and kill as many people. No, these are armies that were out to destroy Israel. And there is no explicit named killing of Canaanite civilians. Now, we may want to discuss this, like it says, men and women. That's a particular phrase that occurs in Joshua 6 and 7 with reference to Jericho and Ai. It actually isn't all men and women and old men and children. It actually is Me'ishva ad isha in Hebrew, which means from man to woman. And it's just a stereotypical way of saying everybody. It doesn't say there had to be women there. It doesn't say there had to be non-combatants there. It doesn't say there had to be children there. It just is anyone who was there. So if this is a fort, then it's primarily soldiers, and I believe that's what it was. And again, the focus in chapter 10, where they take out the Southern Coalition, it's armies. It's armies against armies, and then the kings who are killed as a result of that. It's not civilians and non-combatants. It does say in verses 28 to 42 of chapter 10, it goes through and says, and they went to this town, and they went to this town, and they destroyed, everyone in it they put to the sword. But think about, just for a moment, just suppose this really happened as it's described, and you're sitting in one of these towns like Makkedah or Hebron or one of the other towns, and your army has gone to fight the Israelites, because all these armies went as a coalition against Israel. So they're gone. You've got no army left. And you're average Joe civilian sitting there, and you're hearing the news that your army has been completely destroyed. It's been wiped out. So what are you going to do? You're going to sit in the town and say, well, I hope they don't see me, when they show up, because they'll kill me. No, you'll do exactly what the Israelites do in the book of Judges when they're harassed. They run to the hills. They hide out in the hills and caves. And interesting, the text of Deuteronomy 20, which talks about this and commands the Israel to come in and destroy, says the cities. Come in and destroy the cities. And that's the emphasis in chapters 10 and 11. And I believe they did destroy the cities because the cities were the center of an ideology of oppression and force and false religion. That's where the temples were. That's where the armies, garrisons were. And they destroyed the ability of these to continue to fight against Israel, if you actually read it. Interestingly enough, very interestingly, they don't settle in any of these cities. They don't settle it. Where does Israel actually settle? Archaeologically, the evidence in 1200 BC, and also in terms of what you read in the books of Judges, Ruth, and First Samuel, and the generations afterwards, as well as references in Joshua 13 to 21 for specific events that take place, like Caleb's conquest, or of Hebron, or Joshua's given a specific plot of land for burial, or the important text in chapter 17, 14 to 18, where the Israelites come and say, we need more land. We have too much, we don't have enough land. What did Joshua say? Well, kill some more Canaanites and take their... No, he says, go up into the hill country. Go up into the hill country and clear out the brush that's there and occupy that. And that's what we see archaeologically. Interestingly enough, I would place the date of the conquest of Canaan, as it's often called, about 1210, 1215 BC. Well, if you do that, the period before that, the 13th century BC and 14th archaeologically, between the Jezreel Valley and the Sea of Galilee in the north, and Jerusalem, Bethlehem, that area in the south, there are maybe 24 sites total. That's it, in all that hill country area. Around 1200 BC, there's an explosion of villages. There are upwards approaching 300 villages that have been identified archaeologically. This is the attestation, in my view, of where Israel first settles. And it settles in land that isn't occupied. So this idea, I remember I was debating about this with someone who, had good intentions, but they were convinced. So one of their arguments is, well, see, the Israelites, they're just like the white colonial settlers who came into America and wiped out the Native Americans, the Indians, and took their land. I said, no, actually, whatever you may think of those events, nothing like that happened in the book of Joshua. Furthermore, the Israelites fought wars of defense in chapters 10 and their major battles were battles of defense. If they had not fought them, they would have been wiped out. The Canaanites came after them for genocide. So this, in one sense, you can say, is how the Canaanites repaid Israel for generations earlier through Joseph, keeping them alive by giving them food. So it's a kind of I see it as a verse. Rather than a genocide against Israel, I mean a genocide against the Canaanites, I see it as a genocide against Israel that was attempted.
So that all makes sense from like a historical archaeological perspective, and some of those are things that with that additional information fills out some of the picture. The challenge for the average person is that when we're reading it, we simply see the language that's used, and you've got things that say completely destroy them, everything that breathes, from man to woman, even if that's an idiom. But it goes on to say to kill all the animals and leave alive nothing. Like these kinds of things are very strong language, and so there's something about that makes us say, why would God even say it that way? Why would it come across as nothing can be left? When that feels so antithetical to those other things we know, like God wants to bless the nations and he wants to save people like Rahab and so on. It feels, just seemingly out of character.
Okay, yeah, and I understand that. I would divide here what's said in Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy 20 in particular. I think you. At one point, maybe have that text there. I don't know, but Deuteronomy 20.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 20 says this: "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." And then in Joshua 6, at Jericho, it says, "They devoted the city to the Lord to be destroyed with the sword, every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys." And then Joshua 10, which you've mentioned, Joshua subdued the whole region. He left no survivors, totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. So that's, I mean, on a surface reading,
No,
it just feels extensive, you know?
yeah. No, I want to feel that and appreciate that. Deuteronomy 20 is part of a law which teaches the holiness of God. And the holiness of God, there are two things about God that are essential characteristics of him, and very important. One is that God is holy. And because he is holy, he cannot and won't ultimately allow that which is contrary to his will to go on and simply prosper and be blessed. He can't do that because it stands opposed to him. But the other part of God is he is loving. He is essentially love. In fact, the Christian faith teaches an essence of God's love that is perhaps unique among the great monotheistic faiths that believe in just one God, because we believe that God is three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, from all eternity. Therefore, God did not have to create something to love. Love he could love between the three persons of the Trinity, and that love can be there as an essential characteristic of God. This is so important because it balances out the holiness aspect. Now they're together and integrated, and God gets it right. We're called to be holy and loving. We get it wrong, so you got to. God help us, but he does. That's a great thing about him. But the point is that I want to make is there is a holy aspect of God, and the law teaches that holiness, teaches his love too, and we can talk about that, but it teaches his holiness. And when it comes there in Deuteronomy 20, he is teaching what it means for Israel not to be involved and be associated with nations round about, that they would lead them to worship other gods. And that is an absolute categorical statement. Now, law by its nature is often like that. It tends to be categorical. And once we actually look at what happens on the ground, however, it doesn't quite play out that way. And God works with his people, and he allows, and he is merciful to them. So I want to start with that because most people aren't concerned about it. They're not, that's not the stumbling block. Usually that gets drawn in as another example, Deuteronomy 20. But if that's all that was there, if Joshua wasn't, hey, I don't think this would be as big of an issue. But how that plays out is what happens in Joshua. So what actually happens in Joshua? Yeah. Well, I've kind of gone over some of that and tried to present my case for it. And if you look at it, for sure, there are battles, and for sure, people die according to the text. But I would argue against the view that non-combatants, civilians, young people, old people, women who were not fighters in by and large, although there are exceptions like Deborah, who is a general of the armies and things, but by and large, and so that these people were not the targets of Israel. And when it says, as a young and old, that to me is an expression. It's like donkeys and so forth. What if Israel came into Jericho and for whatever reason there were no donkeys? Does that mean that they had to find a donkey, bring it into the city and kill it in order to fulfill that command? No, it's a way of saying everything in the city.
Yeah.
Everyone and all living creatures, they all are devoted to God. This is a very kind of theological term that's used there, cherem, which means that it's a way of saying giving back to God what belongs to him. It's often used in warfare where people and nations and cities are destroyed. In fact, it's used by other nations of their gods as well to give back to him. But it's also used in more peaceful context. Devoting to cherem is also pottery and other things, vessels that are used for the temple and for holy purposes. So So I want to say that because to me, as I say, I argue that with Jericho and Ai, as you're looking at those texts, the way it's written, using this particular phrase, which only occurs about 7 times in the Bible, from man to woman, which gets translated all the men and all the women. Yeah, but it's actually it's not saying there were women or non-combatants there that were killed. It's just saying everyone in the fort, as I would call it. And that's the same thing as we move into the stories of the Southern Coalition, which you mentioned, chapter 10. They went and there was nobody. There was nobody left is maybe a bit of a hyperbole. It's like later on they say with regards to Israel killing the army and peoples of Edom, that there were no Edomites left. But then a generation later, we've got an army of Edomites, where they come from. This is an expression, this is a way of expressing things in battle, in warfare, but also in recounting, which is saying, I wiped everybody out, I completely destroyed them. But there were then, because we see that, I mean, look, in chapter 10, you've got, there was nobody left among the Canaanites, but in the book of Judges, there are Canaanites everywhere. Where do these people come from? They're intermarrying, they're leading people astray. Gideon is half Canaanite. Some of the other people, Shamgar is not an Israelite name, may have been from among the Canaanites. I don't know. You got all of these, and then you've got the Canaanites and Midianites and the other groups that are oppressing Israel. So whatever, what is being described there, while I think it's a victory of the armies of Israel over against the armies of Canaan, I don't see it as genocide. But it does require us to actually look at the text and read it. And this is one thing that most people don't do. They sometimes, or that is the danger. You take out this verse, and you pull them out and you say, see, this is what's going on. But it's not when you actually look at it. As I say, if you look at chapter 10 and chapter 11, read those. It says, in chapter 10, and all the Southern Coalition saw what had happened with Gibeon going over to Israel, and they decided they're going to go up and wipe out Gibeon, and if they do Gibeon, then Israel is next. And in chapter 11, all the Northern Coalition, led by the king of Hatzor, they come together like the sand on the seashore with chariots and everything, and their purpose, it says there in the text of chapter 11, the opening verses, is to wipe out Israel. So you can hardly say that Israel had no justification for fighting for its own survival. And that's what goes on, as I see it, in these texts in chapters 10 and 11. And there is no genocide because look at the book of Judges. There are Canaanites all over the place. So, where did these guys come from? And so I think we have to look at the whole context in order to understand what's going on.
Let me see if I can sum it up. It sounds like there's 4 big things you've said. One is this was not a one-sided thing. The Canaanites were aggressively coming after Israel. So this was not Israel just coming in and wiping out, people sitting there helplessly. Second, when we talk about cities, we think of places where lots of people live. But you're saying, no, this is probably referring to military installations. These are base. We should think base, not what we call a city. We should think what we call a military base, which has a lot of people living in it, but they're people who are associated with the army. And then third, the language, we read it on the surface as saying, well, they just killed men, women, children, old people, everybody. And really you're saying that's rhetorical, saying anybody who is present. And when you're talking about anybody present at a military base, you're talking about soldiers. And then the fourth thing is, if you actually just look at who's around afterwards, they say they wiped out everybody, but most of the plot of the next several books of the Bible require people of the land still living there. They obviously didn't wipe them all out because they're around for a long time. So whatever happened, it wasn't complete genocide. Either that or they don't know how to talk about it right? They use the wrong language. So so those are hard pieces for people to put together, but it's helpful to hear all of that,
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I know when I wrote my commentary, what they call the literary method was just coming into play. And I think I was one of the first to try to apply that to Joshua. And as you do, read carefully the text rather than read it like, well, I've just watched Josh and the Big Wall and VeggieTales, so I know what's going on, or whatever my favorite, story of Joshua is. But actually read it like you're hearing it for the first time, and you want to understand it. I believe that Jericho and on the basis of the archaeological and textual evidence, the numbers we have from extra biblical texts of armies at that time in and around, like in Jerusalem and so forth, as well as on the basis of the biblical stuff, is small. That these are forts maybe of 100 or something or less, or maybe a couple hundred soldiers. These are not big cities. Now, the others, like those that are mentioned in Joshua 10, verses in the coalition in verses 28 to 42 in the south, I can show you archaeologically. These are bigger centers. These are centers. It's kind of like these are little city states. And here is the city, Makedah or Hebron or Jerusalem. But that city isn't large enough to accommodate all of the peasants, or whatever you want to call them, the average Joe who live. They live in little hamlets around. And now the idea is they have a fortified center. So when there's an army attacking, they can go into that center and their army should help them. But the army's gone. And there's nobody to protect them. So at this point in Joshua 10, it's a different story. And this is where the king lives and his palace and all the powerful people that collect all the taxes and things from really oppressing the Canaanites. There is a point to that, the rest of the Canaanites. And this is where the religious leaders live, their priests, their temples, their worship of other gods and deities. This is where the army is barracked and where they are. This is a kind of redistribution center where the people all work and they bring the grain, which mainly is barley, is what they live on, and a little bit of wheat, and they bring that into there, and then it's redistributed. So the king and others control the population that way. This is all taking place, and we have evidence of this archaeologically. I've got the texts. I did my doctorate on these texts from this era, and so that's what's going on here, and it's helpful to see that. And there's no reason to think about it again. If you're the average person and you hear your army's been destroyed, what are you going to do? Well, you really have you head for the hills probably. You could leave and just go someplace else, leave the country. And there's no mandate for Israel to go hunting down people who run away. And the third thing is you could convert like Rahab does, or secretly, kind of like the Gibeonites do. And that puts you in good. There's nothing that says you couldn't. But according to chapter 11 of Joshua, those are the only people who did in this first generation. So we don't have a lot of that going on, but we do have a lot of Canaanites.
Yeah.
They're around.
So it's maybe a way to sum it up. You can tell me if this is right. Is it God was having them go in and destroy the Canaanite system, not necessarily the Canaanite people, right? So they're taking out armies, they're taking out kings, they're taking out these economic places, but the people scattered around the land are not necessarily the target of that.
That's exactly right. That's a very good way of putting it, Clayton, because what we see is in the generation after that, until a few generations later, and then they're fighting enemies from outside of the land who come in. But the Canaanites are not a power that oppresses Israel or creates a problem for them. And yet there are Canaanites around. There are peasants, or whatever you want to call them, around. So there's this generation or two where you have you don't have those armies, and you no longer have those bases of ideological force set against Israel to try to destroy them.
Yeah. Let me ask about some particular passages here. We've talked a bit about Jericho here, but I want to talk about the aftermath of that. So there's this story in Joshua 7 where a man named Achan, he takes some of the plunder that's left in the city, a robe and some gold and silver, and he takes it and hides it. And when Israel goes to fight the next battle, they lose that battle. And it is because they discover later Achan has taken some of this stuff. Now, that's a story that seems odd to most of us for two reasons. One is, what's the big deal? They just won a battle. He took some of the loot. It seems like the sort of thing that would happen. So, the guy wanted some gold. It's maybe he shouldn't have had it, but what's the big deal? But the second question is, why would this one guy's sin affect everybody? So there's a couple of things about that we say, I just don't get this story. Help us understand it.
No, it's such an important story. Let me tell you, this is a important story about the terrible impact of sin, of willful sin and disobedience. And it's really a sad story in some ways. First, let's focus in on Achan and his family, who also seem to be at least complicit in this because he hides it in his tent. According to the text. And it's hard to believe that he brought this gold, a significant amount of gold and silver, a Babylonian garment, and some other things in there, and hid them without his family knowing. They did know. But the thing about this was God had given Israel, well, everything. And here he was giving them Jericho. And the walls fall down. And now Israel enters into Jericho and takes everything. But God says, look, this is something I am giving you. And it's pretty clear because it's like a miracle, It's not like Israel, oh, well, we did it, we stomped and yelled and the walls all fell down because of that. But God did it. And so I'm doing this. And I'm doing this for you to show you that no human barrier can stand in the way of me. And I'm giving the Jericho, by the way, it's giving the people of Jericho, I believe the army of Jericho, 7 days. They're walking around the city 7 days carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They've just crossed the river with a miraculous holding back of the water. They know what Israel did with Sihon and Og and completely wiped them out. And now it says they nagothed around the city 7 days using the Hebrew. That's the same term that appears in the Psalms where it says, walk around Jerusalem and consider her defenses. There it's admire the defenses of Zion and Jerusalem. Here, it's a kind of ceremonial walking around to see whether there is anything open, whether Jericho will open its gates like Rahab opened her window, whether Jericho will open its gates and allow them to come in, allow this. They do it 7 days. Jericho knew what this was about, and they kept tightly shut up, as verse 1 of chapter 6 says. Then on the seventh day, they do it 7 times. Well, it's pretty clear something's going to happen. And then the trumpets, and they come in. But it's all under God's control. It's all his will. Now, he says, all of this is mine. Whatever happens to it after that, maybe I will give you something. Maybe I've already given you all the food because they're coming in at harvest time for the barley harvest. They've just celebrated Passover. The 7 days they march around are actually the 7 days of unleavened bread. This is infusing the whole events of Passover and unleavened bread with new meaning that applies to that generation of salvation, of God's work, of his will, and now in the land. And I've just given you the barley harvest of this whole region for you to eat and to have. Just give this to me and devote it to me so that you recognize that I have given you this. And there's no question about it. Achan says, no, I'm not going to do it. I see some money here. Wow, this is like, in modern day churches where people swindle the church and take. If you're going to swindle some other organization, but don't do it to the church of all things. How you bring, disbelief and dishonesty upon the church, and it looks so bad, like so much of this. That's what happens. So Achan does this, and so he is punished. It is the most serious of things, and he ultimately God says this is the one, because they do it by lots according to the will of God. And Joshua says to Achan, now confess and give glory to God, and he does. But as for every sin and offense, there can be forgiveness, and I believe there could be for Achan and what, but there is also punishment. There is also the consequences, and so he must be killed and is killed as a sign to the rest of Israel that God cannot allow this kind of dissension in the ranks. And remember, it's an army. You don't have people doing their own thing in an army and doing whatever they want. It's all under the control of the general, the leader. And if he says don't do this, then you really aren't to do this. And the penalty of death is not at all unusual in that kind of context. But I want to go one step beyond that, because you said the impact of sin. If you read in chapter 3, 4, and 5 of Joshua, the opening verses there, you will see, and Rahab's confession as well in chapter 2, verses 9 to 11. By the way, Rahab's statement in 2, 9 to 11 is a classic confession of faith in God. I could go into this a little bit more, but she basically confesses the historic act of God's redemption in the Exodus, and then appropriates that for herself. It is as close to a confession that we have coming into the New Testament of belief in Jesus and his historic act of resurrection. Look at Romans 10:9. That's Rahab. In chapters 3, 4, and 5, and with Rahab, you see all the Canaanites, they're all scared. It says they are so scared, no one dares approach Israel because of their fear. And why is that? Well, because Israel, and even after chapter 6, no one dares approach them because of the fear of Israel, because they have won victory after victory. There has been no failure. And they know this. And the Canaanite kings, they don't want to fight. What are your rates of success? Your chances? 0. Well, who wants to do that? But what did the sin of Achan result in chapter 7? It resulted in Israel's first assault on Ai being repelled, and they're losing the battle, and they're losing lives, dozens of lives of Israelite soldiers that had to pay for Achan's sin. But it's more than that. Because after that, in chapter 8, in chapter 9, in chapter 10, in chapter 11, what do the Canaanites do now? They're no longer afraid. They come up en masse against Israel. They believe, they know that Israel now can be defeated because of what happened, because ultimately of Achan's sin. It can be defeated, and so they will throw everything against it and seek to wipe it out. The picture dramatically changes. And why does it change? It changes because of that sin, ultimately. Because the sin of that one man, sadly, brought about a lack of fear among the Canaanites and all the death that subsequently followed. I don't like to play what if, but think about it. What if Achan had not sinned? What if Israel had completely defeated, and then Jericho, and then Ai? What if that had followed, and there had been the whole picture of what happened after that might have been significantly different.
There might have been more Rahabs in a sense. People
Absolutely.
who said we can't defeat this God, so we're going to submit to this God. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it really is a tremendous story of the consequences of sin. And may God help us to be convicted by it and use it. Whereas Rahab's just the opposite. Rahab's the one who believes, who turns. And I might throw something else in here. If you take the story of the destruction of Jericho in chapter 6, And I'm talking about not after they march around and everything, they blow the trumpets. Now the actual story of the walls falling down, them going in and fighting, and you compare that, because interwoven with that in chapter 6 is the rescue of Rahab and her family, and they are saved. And yeah, I actually counted the Hebrew words. There's like about 102 Hebrew words describing the destruction of Jericho. And there's about 85 Hebrew words describing the salvation of Rahab and her family. Now, I don't think the author sat down and counted the words, but what that shows me is the salvation of Rahab and her family was as important to the author of Joshua as the destruction of Jericho. And we often don't see it that way, but there you have it.
Yeah. That the salvation, we read Joshua and say, oh, it's this book of destruction. They go in and it's also a book of salvation, and we can miss that point.
It really is, yeah.
Well, let me ask you about another strange story about the people of the land here. And you alluded to it very briefly, but the Gibeonites. So we've got this story where you've got this group of people who see that the Israelites are coming in, the Israelites are winning battles and so on. And they say, okay, what's our defense? So they dress themselves up in, tattered old clothes. They get some, luggage that's, beat up, and supplies that are beat up, and put it on their animals. And they're coming through, and they pretend to be nomads, like they don't live in the land. And they come to the Israelites and say, "Hey, we're traveling from another place. Will you be kind and not attack us?" And they make an alliance. And then a little bit later, it's revealed, oh wait, they do actually live here. They're Canaanites. They're the people that we've been fighting. And the Israelites are upset about that because the deception. It bothers them. There's an anger to that. What's this story about? It feels like a slightly amusing story that this would be the tack that someone would take. But why is it included in Joshua? There's a significance to it here.
Mm-hmm. You wonder how many times we have in our lives enjoyed God's blessing and success, victory over all kinds of things, or God is blessing us with family, with friends, with employment, with resources, with all kinds of things. And we fail to really see that this is from God, give him credit, and really continue to lay everything before him, because it all belongs to him from the beginning. Achan did this, of course. But the Israelites, maybe not in as dramatic a way, but nevertheless in a similar way, fell into this there in chapters 8 and 9 of Joshua. Because they go through, and in the end, they do defeat Ai. They wipe the sin out. And so, okay, we're doing pretty well here. We've got Jericho, we've got Ai. God has been good to us. So what happens when this party shows up, these emissaries or whatever, messengers show up? They come in, and we're from a far distant land, and your fame has spread. You're the greatest guys ever. And we just want to have a treaty with you. We'll do whatever. We will be your servants, your water drawers and wood cutters and whatever you want us to be. But we just have so much respect for you, and we want this. I begin to think how often that has happened, and how it happened in my life. And I guess we're pretty good. Yeah, okay. Let's, where do I sign here to get you guys in? And they don't bother to bring this before God. And they don't bother to seek him first. And the results are that they wind up creating a treaty with a group that they really should not have at that point. Now, maybe had the Gibeons come in after that and said, we lied, you can do to us as you want. And but we now recognize that your God revealed this to you, and so we are ready to submit to him. They didn't do that, and so they paid a price, and the price was that they compromised their faith in the eyes of those around them, and they lost out. And they confessed that before God, and Joshua falls on his face before God. And in the end, God says, you made this covenant. You do not violate your word. James talks about this. Don't swear by things in heaven above or on the earth below, because then you have to follow through on them or you sin again. And so that's what happens. And of course, Gibeon, in one sense, becomes part of that drawing in the whole southern coalition of armies that they wind up fighting and everything else. But really what's going on here is it's a challenge for us to hear that God is not to be mocked, and he is not to be forgotten about. And one of the great problems with Israel is every time they get blessed, and like in the Judges and things, and they're secure, and they have land, and they have food, and they have freedom from enemies, they wind up going into the worship of other gods. Now, that's not what happened here with worship of other gods. They just didn't worship God, the true God, and they set that aside. So I see the purpose of this as a lesson here in the midst of success in terms of what Israel is doing and settling in the land, that they forget to always bring everything before God and let him guide our lives day by day and moment by moment.
Yeah. All right. So after about, say, chapter 10, okay, we get through a bunch of the stories, and those are challenging for the reasons we've talked about. The second half of the book becomes challenging for a different reason, and that's because, frankly, as a daily Bible reader, it's very tedious. It's lists of cities and kings that Israel defeated. After about chapter 13, you've got a detailed description of distributing this territory and that territory in this land and that land and so on, and it feels to us like, I don't know, my eyes just glaze over, and you look at the reading plan and you say, how many more days do I have to read Joshua here? And to us it seems like, well, you could have skipped that, God. You only had a few thousand pages in the Bible, and you've spent 5 or 10 of them on this stuff. Why do we need it? But to the original audience, it must have been very important. So help us understand why this is significant, why it's in the book, and how do you recommend the average Bible reader handling this part of the book?
Yeah, no, it's not your first port of call, if you're introducing somebody to the Bible. There are sections in the Bible that are difficult for us because we're not of the same culture and time. We don't see and hear things in the same way. It's like you get into Leviticus, like I say, you have all of these different commands and ceremonies and slaughtering of animals and things. What's that about? And why do I have to read that? Or you get into, even before that, in the genealogies of Genesis. Well, the beginning, so-and-so begot so-and-so, and so-and-so begot so-and-so. What is that about? But once you begin to understand that, first of all, it is a different culture. Secondly, there is a theme here of the importance of the family of God and his concern for his people. And so the genealogy begin to make sense in terms of identity, of who we are and what our connections are and how God operates in each generation he's present. Or the Levitical laws, how these form the backdrop for the whole understanding of why Christ had to die on the cross and what that means for discipleship. Very important. Now you come to, from chapter 13 especially through 21, you got hundreds of place names, and what are all these about? And I agree that they don't hold the same amount of interest, but they are important because the whole book of Joshua can be understood in the terms of the ancient Near East. It's a certain type of literature which you can describe as a land grant. It is the grant of a superior, and in the documents of the ancient Near East, we often have it as a kind of super general or king to his vassal, who he gives in response for being faithful against land and things like this. We have examples of this that I've studied and could point you to. So we have that, and part of that has to be listing out what it is that they're giving. You see, God made a covenant with Israel. And the importance of that covenant was he established a relationship with Israel. There's all kinds of important aspects about the background of this covenant. It's like an ancient Near Eastern treaty. It has certain aspects to it, and you can see that in Deuteronomy. The historical background in the opening chapters as motivation for Israel to continue to be faithful, for God can then bless them, and then the stipulations and all the laws, because those are important, because that's how Israel responds to God in being faithful to God. And then the promises of blessings and the warnings of curses at the end of that, and how they all fit together. Well, now we come to Joshua in a land grant document, and you have the description of how God has been faithful in guiding Israel into the land, and then giving them the land and victory over their enemies. But then there comes the sense in which now they're going to have that land distributed. And this is God's response to Israel. Israel's covenantal response to God is to love God. And that means at its base, it's not the only thing, but it means to be loyal to God. It means to be faithful to God. And God says, in response to that, I will be faithful to you, and I will give you this land, and I will give you X, Y, and Z in terms of the cities and the towns. And so this whole list of towns from 13 to 21 there are actually a couple parts of it is mainly made up of town lists and also of boundaries between the tribes, lists from one town to another to establish the tribes. And then it's also made up of some stories there, particularly like Caleb taking Hebron, or Zelophehad and Zelophehad's daughters receiving some of the land, unlike usually it goes through the male line, or Joshua is having a place to die, a place where he is buried. A number of these stories, but a lot of it this is an expression of God's faithfulness to his people. And I might add here as a kind of footnote, I don't think that all of these towns that are mentioned there were towns that existed during the time of Joshua. I think this is a judicial document that existed for centuries in Israel, and it would be updated to fill in those towns, because a lot of them, like in Judah, you have dozens and dozens of towns, and especially around the Dead Sea, you have the En-Gedi area and things like this. You have towns which archaeologically these don't exist before the 8th or 7th century. But if you were trying to maintain a document that preserved and helped judges and others to help to sort out land disputes and what have you, this is exactly what you would have.
Yeah.
And you would use this, and it would be updated, not changed in terms of the lands, but it would be updated in terms of the details. And I think that it continued in this way. But I think when Israel heard it, they heard and understood the faithfulness of God in giving them this land and the blessing of God. These towns and these places were places where they lived, where they bore their families, where they had children and the next generation, where they could look back on their ancestors and the covenant, where they lived out their lives faithfully, where they enjoyed the fruits of the land, the barley, the wheat, the grapes, and the vineyards and the vegetables and all that abundance, and where they lived securely. God had given them this land as they were faithful to the covenant, they enjoyed it. So that's what they heard.
Yeah.
Now the question is, if we read it, can we hear that? Well, probably not in the same way. And so we're kind of driven either to actually, and you try to do that. We don't know where all these places are. We haven't identified them all. But you try to identify and appreciate them, and you could spend a good deal of time on each one to study it, to understand what it's what witness it has for the people. Sometimes we know more about some of these areas, or you can also simply hear it read and realize that this is part of God's faithfulness to his people in that generation. It's a little bit like today, where we might realize, where God has blessed us, and look at the lands and places and pray for mission work that's being done, pray for where there are needs of that we have as people, pray for persecution of Christians in other parts of the world, and see that God's kingdom is manifest in very specific ways like this. And so as we pray for people, and as we pray for where they are, we begin to see that that's important here. And if this has a significance, I think that it would drive us forward to see the presence of the kingdom of God in geographically today as the church across the world, and in its various needs and concerns.
Yeah. Two analogies came to mind as you were talking, thinking about reading this kind of thing. I think about, I own a home, and so we've got a document that we went through for, an hour or whatever, signing things, and it feels very tedious and technical and so on. But that document is very, very important. It means something incredibly important to me and my family, that this is our home and our land where we can dwell and be secure. And even though reading through it isn't the most exciting thing, it's more significant than almost any other document in my life. It says something important. The other analogy that came to mind is, so my children, after they go trick-or-treating, on Halloween, they will get all their candy, and they will lay all their candy out, and they will count how many of each kind of candy they have, and this many Reese's and this many Snickers, and they write it down. And for them, that list that says I got 10 Snickers is the best news in the world to them. They say, look at what I got. Now, if I look at their list and I just see a list of candy bars, I think, okay, this is just a list. But when you're the one receiving the gift, when you're the one who now has this thing to enjoy, that list that otherwise is just a bullet point feels like incredible news. I can imagine being the Israelites and saying, look at this, we got this land and that territory, and this is the place where we live, and God gave us these incredible gifts. Aren't we going to love it? There's something with more heart there than just the kind of, it's a territory line, that sort of thing. That if you were on the receiving end, you would say, oh my goodness, look at what we've got, that we miss a little bit because of that. Let me ask about a particular set of cities that is listed in that area. There are two. They designate some cities that are called cities of refuge. And then there are some cities that are given to the Levites. And I would love for you to fill us in. What's the point of those cities? What does that mean that they're given to those things?
Yeah, no, those are really important. They come at the end.
Yeah.
Of after all the allotments, and there's a reason for that too. I think what this is suggesting, okay, God says, I'm giving you all this through the priests and so forth as they allot the land, and the map makers who go in for some of the tribes and try to parse things out in terms of what the land looks like. And that's all done at the end of chapter 19. Then with chapters 20 and 21, there's a kind of reverse where God says, okay, I've given you all this. Now I want some of these towns set aside for my purposes. I want, in a sense, you to give them back to me. And the first one are the towns of refuge. Now, those aren't really that different. They still belong to Israel in its different tribal areas. But the towns of refuge, they're mentioned multiple times, not just in Joshua, but in the law, and they appear. And they provide a very important role, of course, as you may know. If somebody a source, if somebody intentionally kills another person, they commit murder, and they know there is no refuge for them. Even if they go into the sanctuary, they're to be dragged out of the sanctuary and they are to be punished. If they go into a city like this, they are to be brought out because there is no refuge. But if they're working with somebody else, and like happens in the book of Cain, at one point an axe head flies off and it hits the other person and they die, then what happens? And throughout history, and certainly at the time of ancient Israel, there is a principle in ancient clan life and kinship life called the vendetta. And we think of this sometimes with regards to mafia and things like this today, organized crime. But it exists and always has, where one family who a member of their family has been killed by a member of another family, even if it is accidental, they have to or feel obligated to take revenge on that person, and that person must die. And so there is here the provision that even if this person is innocent, declared to be innocent, they have a place to escape to. What's interesting is this has always existed, but usually you get to flee. If you flee to another country or another land. You get away. The point of the cities of refuge is to recognize that God has set aside this land for every Israelite and every member of the covenant. So if you accidentally kill someone else, you don't have to leave the land. You can stay in the land, continue to enjoy the blessings and covenant life in the land, in one of these cities, and these cities are set aside to protect you and to provide a place for you to live, so that you are not and the people of the city will defend you, so that you are not brought out and killed by the family of the victim from at that time. So that is what I see as a purpose. It's part of the testimony of the covenant and the value of the covenant land that God has given to his people. The other one is the Levitical cities. There are more of those. And they're divided by tribes. They're divided across the whole land. And this is very interesting. The Levites are the tribe from which the priests come, and the Levites themselves are also sort of priestly. They aren't actual priests, the rest of them, but they do the jobs of taking care of the different ceremonial and holy things. Interesting, according to Leviticus 10:11, the priests and I think the Levites as well are called upon not only to perform sacrifices, but they're called upon to teach the people the law or the word of God. In other words, they're the preachers and teachers, and to represent that word to the people so that they know. So they have to be educated and this sort of thing. Now, in most societies and other religions, and also in Israelite religion, certainly by the time of Jesus, what happens is the priestly group becomes a very special group. They acquire property, they acquire power, they acquire wealth, and they become among the wealthiest wherever you have priests. Priests, and sadly, that's true to date. Sometimes people gain wealth and power on the basis of becoming, mega church path, whatever. You know how best-selling authors and whatnot. But Israel, God from the beginning intended for that not to happen. That's why he said the priests and Levites shall have no lands given to them. Every other tribe has lands. Lands are the means in that agrarian society for producing wealth. Not only do you survive off the land as farms and things, and both with vegetables and foods like that, and also with cattle and sheep and whatnot, but it also, the surplus enables you to sell it and to gain more wealth. And so it is wealth producing. But the priests and Levites are not allowed to have any of that. They're not allowed to have that kind of resource. They have instead set aside for them towns and cities and villages where they can live, but they don't have land except immediate, some land around. If they have some flocks and herds for sacrifices, perhaps, and other things, they have that, and that's it. Mm. There is a sense in which the priests and Levites were originally intended not to be rich in wealth, but to be dependent upon God and upon the people bringing the sacrifices. Yeah. And of course, then they get a portion of some of those sacrifices. And that's what they are dependent upon. So there was always this sense in which their dependence was clearly borne witness of as coming from God, not from gaining property and wealth for themselves. Now, as I say, as so often happens, that changed by the time of Jesus, and the Sadducees, especially, and Pharisees, and the legal people, the priests, were in fact very wealthy and very powerful. But that wasn't God's will, according to the law, and that's why he set aside this was places for the Levites to live. They're also spread across the country, and beyond that, many of them are on the borders with other countries, so that they could bear witness in their teaching. They could teach the Israelites, and they could teach others as well. They could teach them about the law. They could represent the covenant of God and the great works of God and the festivals and celebrations, so that people could live within the covenant and prosper under their connection with God, and God's presence and blessing would be with them, and other nations would see and come tell us about this God.
Yeah.
So that's why you have the Levitical cities and what purpose they serve.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, let's talk about the big finish of the book, okay? So most people who know just a few things about Joshua, they know the story of Jericho at the beginning, and then they usually know some of the verses at the end where, it's people put it on their walls, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And it comes from a speech, or kind of a pair of speeches, where Joshua gathers the leaders of Israel and then the people of Israel, and kind of gives a final charge to them. So help us understand why what he's doing there, and why this is kind of the conclusion of this book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really interesting. It's in Joshua 23. He gathers the people and he goes over things with them, and they kind of affirm his will, God's will. And then in chapter 24, he sets it out in a little more detail. And sometimes you have this idea of doing things twice, so that you have an affirmation and nobody can say, I don't remember that. But, if it happened twice, it helps. And you see that there. And again, you have something, the 24 is a renewal of the covenant for that generation, somewhat similar in its overall structure to Deuteronomy and some of the other legal documents in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books. And that is, you have, first of all, the identification of Israel's God as the sovereign who's in charge. And it represents, in many ways, it's a similar structure that the people would have known of what are called vassal treaties from the 13th century BC. And they, first of all, introduce the god, not the god in the sense of the treaties. It's usually the emperor, the one in charge of everything, who gets to make the treaty with the vassal. And that's God here. And then they introduce Israel, who worshipped other gods beyond the river in the past until they got to know the true God. And they go quickly through, there in the opening verses of chapter 24, a history. And as I said, this idea of a historical review of Israel's experience is to show that when Israel was loyal to God, he was loyal to them and he blessed them. When they turned away and sinned, he could not bless them. And so they went through hard times. And so part of that is learn the lesson of the past. It's not just an obscure history lesson. It's learn the lesson of the past and know that as you are faithful to God, as you love him, he will bless you. And you can live in his covenantal faithfulness. And then comes what are called the stipulations. Now, they're very, very brief, but they do emphasize, as in the treaties, loyalty to the sovereign. be faithful to God and loyal to him, hear him and obey him and respond to him. And that's what the people are called to do. And they then respond. This isn't always in the trees because the trees are written documents, but here we have it's a kind of narrative telling us about what happened. And people said, we will do it. And he says, no, you can't, you will sin. And they say again, no, we will do it. And it's interesting, this happens when in the first covenant, back in Exodus 24, twice the people say, yes, we will do all the words that are written in the covenant, because there's this idea by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, and there's this sense of 2 or 3 times the people say this so that they will remember that they have affirmed it, and they have freely affirmed it of their own will. It's not like Joshua went around and said, well, I'm going to kill you if you don't obey. No, he said, this is what God calls you to. Will you do it? And they say, yes, we will. And so twice they do, and Joshua responds and bears witness to them, just as he establishes there and elsewhere a stone of witness there at Shechem. And he says, these are witnesses. In the treaties, the witnesses were usually the gods. But of course, in Israel, you don't have any other gods. And the one true God is a member of the treaty. He's the sovereign. Yeah. So they don't call other gods. They call witnesses like a stone or something that the people will look to and remember that there's a reason for why that was put there. Or Joshua's words, as for me and my house, look to us. And we are the witnesses to this. So to being faithful to God. So I think that's what's going on here. And then there is the promise that God will bless them. There's also the warning that they turn away and he will not. And that works itself out in the book of Judges, as we see in the following generations. But I think that's what's going on here in this. This is really a mini kind of treaty or covenant that he makes between God and the people so that they will understand that as the new generation arises, the call to faithfulness remains the same. And then, of course, you have the notes at the end of the passing of Joshua and of the priests of that generation.
Yeah. Let's wrap up with this question. As we take a step back and we look at the Joshua in the context of the whole story of the Bible, how does this point forward to Jesus, and how does it connect with us as people in, kind of New Testament believers? What is the relevance of this book for us?
Yes, no, Joshua is an awesome book. And the word Joshua, the name Joshua, Yehoshua, actually, he originally was called Hosea, which means he saves. He delivers, not he as in Joshua, but God delivers. It just has the name of God is omitted. But it says in Numbers 13 and 14 that Moses changed his name when he became one of the spies who went in to spy out the land. He changed his name to Joshua, Yehoshua, which means the Lord, Yahweh. It's a shortened form of the name, the personal name of God, Yahweh. Yahoo is the shortened form of that. Yeshua means salvation. So it means Yahweh is salvation. And it's a confession of God's great salvation. That is the identical name of Jesus in the New Testament. So Jesus bears the name of Joshua and continues that. And the angels and so forth, his name shall be called. Jesus is actually continuing this, and it would have evoked the images of the faithfulness of Joshua, of the call of Joshua to lead the people and to bring them that generation what they understood as the kingdom of God, just as Jesus would now come and proclaim the kingdom of God. And his call to faithfulness, it's very interesting because I said the first verses 2 to 5 lay out the whole structure of the book of Joshua. But read verses 5 through 9, and in there is one of the famous verses, do not let this book of the law depart from you, but meditate on it day and night, and through that you shall succeed and prosper. And we often, sometimes we take that as a memory verse, Joshua 1:8, 1:9. And it's a great memory verse, but it becomes misunderstood because we think, okay, Joshua succeeded and we will succeed if we just learn, meditate on, and obey God's words. That's not really true, because surrounding that in verses 5 and 6 and at the end of verse 9 is the promise that God makes twice in 5 and 6, and once positively in verse 9, and I will never leave you or forsake you, a sort of a negative of it, but saying the same thing. His promise is the promise of the presence of God. Joshua will not succeed because he meditates on, and obeys the word of God. Joshua will succeed because God is with him to enable him to read, meditate on, and obey the word of God as he wills, as God wills for him. Now, fast forward to the same God through Jesus Christ speaking to the apostles in Matthew 28 and giving the Great Commission, where he says to his disciples, go into all the world and preach the gospel, corresponds to go into the promised land and acquire it. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, baptizing them in the name, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. And what does he say at the end? And lo, or behold, or whatever, look, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Again, the mission that is given will not succeed because the disciples are super strong and faithful. The mission will succeed because Jesus, God, is with them to enable them. It is the presence of God that formulates the mission and enables us to live in it and to see and to participate in its success. That's there in the Old Testament with Joshua, and it's there in the New Testament as Jesus gives that commission to his disciples and to us today.
Wow, that's wonderful. Dr. Hess, thank you so much for spending some time with us, helping us understand in much greater detail the book of Joshua and some of the things that are challenging there. This is going to be super helpful. Where can we go to find more of your work?
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I have a website called oldtestamentquestions.com. It's not too hard to remember, but you go there, you can look at questions, you can ask questions, you can see what else I have written, some as free access, you just click onto it. I also edit the Denver Journal. Just type in Denver Journal for it's set up by Denver Seminary, and there's bibliographies. It's a kind of review articles. But what's especially helpful if you study, teach, or preach the Bible, we have New Testament bibliography and an Old Testament bibliography. Includes a variety of things, but goes book by book, and our recommendations for the best commentaries in each book in terms of what will be helpful and successful. I'm not alone. My colleagues in the New Testament department are involved for that part of it, as I am for the Old Testament. And you'll see, I did write a book I have it here, on Joshua. Yes. This is the old, I don't have the newer one, but this is the older one that came out, the commentary on Joshua, as well as a few other books of the Bible and some other books and articles. But it's all in the bibliography there in my Old Testament questions.com website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, I hope for all of you who are watching or listening that this has been really helpful for you, gotten you excited, feel more equipped about the book of Joshua. Over the upcoming weeks here on the Bible Savvy Podcast, Courtney, David, and I, we're going to be doing our usual thing. We're going to be discussing one passage from the readings each week. We hope that you'll join us, and we'll see you next Monday.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us again next Monday for a new episode where we'll be looking at another passage from the Bible Savvy reading schedule. And in the meantime, if you're not following along with the reading plan, check out BibleSavvy.com. Also, you can subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us your questions or suggestions at podcast@BibleSavvy.com. Lastly, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you next week.